Hollywood has been making movies about politics for almost as long as they've been making movies in Hollywood. And over the last 100 years, filmmaking has been a powerful force in shaping political attitudes in America. And after just making it through the recent election cycle and the insane amount of media behind those campaigns, it got me wondering just how much influence Hollywood has had in shaping the political dialogue in the US. So in this video, I'm gonna go through the last century of film history, decade by decade, to see how the best movies of the time changed the relationship between people and their government. And honestly, this was a lot more interesting than I expected, even for a film nerd like me, so let's dive in. Real quick before we get going, this video is meant to be apolitical, and I'm not here to give my opinions on the election that just finished. I mean, I'm Canadian, I'm not even American. And even though I do travel south of the border a lot, and many of my best friends are American, I really have no say one way or the other, regardless of what I might think personally. Plus, I feel like there's been enough news coverage of the election to last a lifetime, so I'm actually gonna do my best not to even mention the results a single time if I can help it. I'm here to talk about film history, not to promote one side over the other. Just wanted to throw that out there because I know there are some strong feelings out there at the moment, and the last thing people need in the States right now is some random Canadian guy telling you what to think on the internet.
We are polite, we are Canadians.
All right, so for any investigation into Hollywood and politics, the first thing we have to understand is when Hollywood actually became a force in the movie business, because it wasn't always. And for that, we have to go way back to 1910 when the director D.W. Griffith shot the first ever movie in Hollywood, which was then just a tiny village in California that pretty much no one had ever heard of. The film was appropriately called In Old California, and it's about the Mexican Revolution. But it's mainly interesting because of what Griffith would go on to make 5 years later with his film The Birth of a Nation. And as we all know, that dusty little village went on to become the global capital of filmmaking, so it's a good place to start. Released in 1915, The Birth of a Nation wasn't about the political process or government policies per se, but it did focus on arguably the most important political event in American history: the Civil War. And it was so influential at the time, and it touched on so many of the political issues of the day, that it's a logical starting point for this video. And let's just be honest here, as historically important as this film might be, it's also extremely problematic and just straight up racist. The movie is silent, like all movies were then, and it follows the stories of two families in the aftermath of the American Civil War. One family is from the North and the other one from the South, and both of them were heavily impacted by the war. The movie's divided into multiple acts, and the first one ends with the assassination of Lincoln. From there, it starts to really push its controversial agenda, which portrays the post-war Reconstructionist era as a time of chaos and oppression in the South. And that's probably pretty true, because wars pretty much always result in chaos and oppression for both sides, but it's especially bad for whoever loses. Pretty standard plot so far, but it starts to take a different turn when the main character, Ben, gets inspired by watching a bunch of kids pretending to be ghosts, which leads to him forming the KKK. These days, there isn't that much love out there for the KKK, which I hope we can all agree is a good thing, but in this movie, the Klan is depicted more like heroic defenders of Southern virtue, even though they're using fear and violence to restore order. There are a ton of racist stereotypes in this movie when it comes to African Americans, generally making them out to be morally corrupt and dangerous, and the final battle of the movie basically ends in a victory for white civilization. I mean, it was so racist that it was actually used by the real KKK as a recruitment tool back in the day, so yeah. Now you might be expecting me to say that this was normal because that was a more racist time in history, and to some extent that's true, but even then the movie was widely seen as offensive and drew a ton of criticism, on top of being absolutely panned by civil rights groups across the country. And the reaction against it was so strong, it led to activists protesting across the country in one of the first clear-cut examples of how movies could lead to actual political consequences in the real world. This wasn't some fluffy love story that people forgot about an hour after they left the theater. It was polarizing, and it forced people to think deeply about their personal political beliefs, one way or the other. Lots of people came away angry about social inequality in their country, while for others it reinforced their existing racist worldview. And that just wasn't the common reaction to entertainment at the time. I mean, most movies in the 1910s were a mix of melodramas and historical epics, slapstick comedies, and maybe some westerns, and the themes were usually all about romance and heroics. Politicians around the country had to notice the reactions to this film though, and they were under a lot of pressure to let their voters know where they stood on these issues, making it much harder to stay silent on human rights abuses. But despite the morally dubious message, the film was groundbreaking from a technical perspective as well, and it pioneered a bunch of new techniques like the close-up shot and high contrast mood lighting, and the battle scenes were more complex than anything anyone had seen before. Today though, that's mainly been overshadowed by the film's problematic message, but it's still worth starting here because this movie had major social consequences, including transforming the Klan into a big symbol for white nationalism and then setting the tone for racial politics in America for decades. Even more than 100 years after it came out, it's an important reminder of the time when power of the media actually started to shape public perception and form political narratives. The rest of the 1910s didn't produce anything quite as divisive as Birth of a Nation, but the 1920s saw another wave of strong political films, and few of them are as famous as The Battleship Potemkin. Now, this is obviously not technically a Hollywood movie as it was made in Russia, but in a lot of ways the impact it had in America was much bigger than the one it had at home. And it was actually more widely seen in the US and around the world than it was in Russia. Plus, it was a Hollywood director who was mainly responsible for the film's international exposure, so it's still very relevant to what we're talking about today. If you haven't heard of it, the story is about a mutiny on a Russian Imperial Navy ship, the Battleship Potemkin, and more broadly, it's about the Russian Revolution. It was actually commissioned by the Russian government to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the actual revolution, and let's be honest, it was written as a straight-up piece of revolutionary propaganda. I'll get into why that matters in a second. Now, setting aside the fact that this film was incredibly well shot and the visuals stand up even today, the movie is also responsible for a bunch of camera techniques that had never been used before. It's also been taught in pretty much every film theory class ever since its release, so the question then becomes, why did a piece of Russian propaganda have any impact on America at all? Well, mainly it's thanks to the actor and filmmaker Douglas Fairbanks, who saw the movie during a trip to Moscow and was so impressed that he helped find American distribution for it. He even brought the director Sergei Einstein, I'm not sure, sorry Sergei, but he brought him all the way to Hollywood to talk about it. And the impact was huge. For one, it pioneered the use of the montage, a technique that's so widespread today that we've seen it in everything from Laurel and Hardy to Dune, and in almost every movie in between. It's on most greatest films of all time lists, and it has a 100% score on Rotten Tomatoes, and we all know how savage the modern internet can be when it comes to reviewing. But more than just changing the technical craft of filmmaking, this movie opened people's eyes to the power of propaganda and political messaging in media, a concept that might sound obvious to anyone today with a Twitter account, but at the time it was revolutionary. Sorry, pun only sort of intended. The film was actually not that well received at home in Russia, as the conditions for the average person were pretty rough and they weren't really in the mood to watch heroic propaganda about it. But despite the fact that it was also banned for a while in the US, the UK, France, and at home in the Soviet Union, around the world filmmakers and politicians were paying attention to how editing and political messaging could be used in these new ways. Nowadays, it's hard to imagine a time when there weren't political messages mixed in with our media, and in a lot of ways we can draw a direct line from the Battleship Potemkin all the way to the frozen food company Steakums Twitter account taking a stand on misinformation. From here on out, any politician that wanted to win had to recognize the power of the media and act accordingly. Jumping forward to the 1930s, we start to see movies making even more direct commentaries on the political system. There's a few examples I could use, but probably the most controversial of all of these was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which is kind of weird because at its core it's billed as a lighthearted comedy. It was incredibly popular at the time and it got nominated for 11 Academy Awards, but one group who didn't share in the love for the movie was the US government. Directed by filmmaking legend Frank Capra, the story focused on a naive senator from Montana, Mr. Smith, who goes to Washington where he sets out to clean up the rampant corruption he finds there. Again, this movie was a satire, not some sort of expose, but American lawmakers were not impressed, even if the audiences loved it. But why? Well, it turns out it was one of the first prominent examples of the American government being portrayed in a negative light on film, and Washington was not pleased. These days, it's probably harder to find a pro-government film, but at the time, it just wasn't really done, and political institutions were more typically shown through rose-colored glasses. When it released, the Senate Majority Leader at the time called it silly and stupid, and then complained that it makes the Senate look like a bunch of crooks. Again, in late 2024, pretty much nobody would be shocked by the idea that politicians could be less than honest, but back then it really wasn't something people had seen. As you might imagine, it was the people in power who were the most angry, like the American ambassador to Britain, who said he was afraid it would damage the US's reputation in Europe. A journalist from the Washington Post even complained that the film showed the American political system in exactly the colors Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin liked to paint them. But the public and critical reception were very different, and now it's seen as one of the quintessential whistleblower films in American history. In a lot of ways, it paved the way for media to start digging deeper into the realities of politics and power instead of just showing it in an idealized light. And it's not a stretch to see that influence in everything from WikiLeaks to Aaron Brockovich. These days, we take it for granted that entertainment has the right to criticize power, but back then, Capra took a lot of heat for it, even if audiences liked it so much it was the third highest grossing movie of the decade. No matter how much politicians must have hated it though, the days of government being safe from creative judgment was over. And now that the way was open for films to openly criticize the government, the 1940s opened with a bang in the form of one of the greatest works of satire of all time. On the surface, this isn't about the US at all and focuses on Europe instead, but that doesn't mean it didn't have just as big of an impact, politically speaking, in America. And here I'm talking about The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. The film centers on the life of a young soldier from a fake country called Tomania, who wakes up after a battlefield injury to find out that his country has been taken over by dictators who are very thinly veiled representations of Hitler and Mussolini. I won't go too deep into the plot here, but along the way, Chaplin's character gets sucked into world events, and eventually he ends up impersonating one of those dictators so that he can bring about an end to the conflict and advocate for peace. The anti-war message was a powerful one, and not at all typical for the time when war films were mostly vehicles for patriotism and heroic actions. According to rumors from his staff, Hitler himself apparently screened the movie twice, and both times he watched it alone. Chaplin famously said he'd give anything to know what he thought of it, and so would I, honestly, because that's the kind of reach from a film that doesn't happen very often. But on the home front back in the US, the movie was important as well, because this was 1940, and at that time the US was still at peace with Nazi Germany. There were lots of people who wanted to change that and join the war, and by exposing the insanity of the European situation through the lens of a comedy, it opened the dialogue in a way that news reports alone couldn't. It was an issue that a lot of people in the US government wanted to ignore in pursuit of a policy of isolationism, but the movie was seen by so many people that it became impossible not to talk about it. The movie was so popular that it was nominated for 5 Oscars, and that's sort of ironic considering that just a year earlier, people were furious about how the government was portrayed in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, but I guess it is usually easier to laugh at other people instead of looking inward. Still, the American public loved it, and the New York Times called it perhaps the most significant film ever produced, so that goes to show you just how much the film industry and its political messages were starting to matter and have public impact. Plus, Chaplin wrote it, produced it, and starred in it, so just think about that the next time you're struggling to finish your 3-minute short. Son of a bitch. By the end of the 1940s, the trend had developed even further. The war was over, and in the aftermath of all that death and violence, people were more aware than ever about the dangers of giving power to the wrong people. Millions had just died because of the decisions of a few men, and the public was deeply suspicious of their leaders in a way that they just hadn't been before. And so when All the King's Men came out in 1949, it touched a nerve for a political climate that was already extremely tense. The movie's based on a book, and it follows the rise and fall of a populist politician named Willie Stark, loosely based on a real former governor of Louisiana, Huey Long. Stark starts out as an idealistic reformer, but as he gets more and more personal power, he just starts to slide into corruption and eventually tyranny. The message is pretty clear here, especially in light of what the world had just gone through. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, so be very careful about who you elect. And considering everything that would happen because of populist leaders in the second half of the 20th century, the warning was a good one. You don't need to work too hard to see some pretty obvious parallels to the current state of politics in America either, where candidates will say and promise just about anything people want to hear in order to get your vote. And once they get what they want, the very people who voted for them often realize too late that those politicians were really just playing the game out in their own self-interest. Not long before, it had been a lot easier for corrupt leaders to kind of quietly operate in the background, but in no small part because of films like All the King's Men, the public was suddenly on the lookout for shady deals and power-hungry people. Now it's the mid-1950s, and this skepticism of political figures and their motives is even more prominent in Hollywood. And the film I want to talk about here somehow managed to predict the election of both Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump decades before they happened. A Face in the Crowd came out in 1957, and it tells the story of a charming drifter named Larry Rhodes, who, through a series of events that don't matter here, ends up getting a job as a radio host. From there, he leverages his position into a TV appearance, which he then builds into a national syndication. Before long, though, things take a turn, and he starts using his power and celebrity to influence the presidential election. I mean, come on, that's pretty amazing to have seen this stuff coming in the 50s, because today, celebrity culture and social influence are some of the most powerful forces in our society. Like, let's be honest for a second, it's not very likely Donald Trump could have gone from real estate developer to the White House if he wasn't a celebrity. And again, this isn't what you think about Trump, but it's undeniable that his celebrity status has allowed him to influence the political situation in America to an insane degree. I mean, at one point there was even talk of The Rock running for president, and Kanye went one step further and actually announced his candidacy. Celebrity and personal brand equal influence in the modern world, but A Face in the Crowd saw it coming almost 70 years ago. Like all the King's Men, this film is critical of populist leaders, and it tried to warn the public about the growing power of media to bring dangerous people into power. Social media, which the writers couldn't have imagined at the time, has taken that and exploded it. So you can only imagine what the filmmakers would think of how things have turned out. Though I guess it is more or less what they were expecting. But it wasn't just film critics who took notice, and now that these tactics were out in the public discourse, politicians ran with them. So it's maybe not surprising that the films of the 1960s went even harder on these issues. The American people now wanted to know who their leaders were, like really were, not just accept them as benevolent talking heads on the evening news. Modern politicians needed to open up to the public in ways that their predecessors never would have dreamed of. And as a very young presidential hopeful, John F. Kennedy understood this better than anyone. So he opened up his entire campaign to a film crew, and the resulting movie, Primary, is one of the most innovative documentaries of all time. It covered the Democratic race between JFK and Hubert Humphrey, but it was the access and the intimacy that made it unlike anything people had seen before. Using modern portable cameras and lightweight sound recorders to capture the behind-the-scenes aspects of an election campaign in a cinema verite style, the filmmakers let audiences experience what it was like to actually be right in the middle of the action. Now, these days we're used to seeing intimate character docs like this, and A-list celebrities have commissioned so many docs about themselves that it's kind of hard to tell what's real and what's just a puffy piece of self-promotion. J-Lo. Sorry.
And all of that was kind of bullshit.
But as common as the all-access doc might feel now, back then audiences hadn't seen anything quite like it, especially when it came to politics. Primary changed the perception of what it meant to know a politician, and it changed the way the game was played. If you wanted to win an election, you had to completely embrace the media spectacle. The more authentic, the better. The legacy of Primary is stronger today than ever, and all those BTS TikTok videos of candidates dancing or playing golf, or those unfiltered podcast appearances, are just the modern evolution of the same thing. And let's be real, Trump took this strategy and went wild with it, probably better than any politician ever. Obama might have started the first White House Twitter account and even appeared on Jerry Seinfeld's show Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, but Trump took it to another level. The guy shows up on podcasts, he sits ringside at the UFC, and he even released footage of himself dancing to the YMCA song in Wisconsin. All this stuff helped big cross-sections of the public to see him as their guy, just a normal person trying to change the system. Now, obviously that doesn't mean who he really is, because I have no idea, and I sort of have a hard time fully relating to anyone who wants to be president, if I'm being totally honest. But there's a direct line to that kind of relatable media strategy in Primary, so for once on YouTube, it's not a stretch to say it changed the game. And it's not just Trump. Harris's campaign did exactly the same thing, releasing footage of her shopping and dancing, and even cooking at home with videos shot on iPhones instead of professional cameras. Hillary Clinton made a cameo on Broad City in 2016, and for an example closer to home in Canada where I live, not long ago Justin Trudeau went on Stephen Colbert's show where he tried really hard to project his image as a normal and relatable guy that made him so popular back in 2015. It's all about appearing real, and that all started in the 60s with Primary. So next time you see a political candidate on TikTok, you can thank a 60-year-old documentary. If that isn't evidence of film influencing politics, I don't know what is. But as groundbreaking as Primary was, by the time we get get to the 1970s, these authentic PR strategies had been used so much that Americans were realizing how manufactured politicians' public images were getting. The public was starting to open its eyes to modern PR, yes, and that manipulation made it harder to trust what you saw on TV, and that was especially true in the political sphere. And few films reflect this skepticism like The Candidate. Starring Robert Redford, the film follows the story of Bill McKay, an idealistic lawyer convinced to run as the Democratic candidate for a U.S. Senate seat in California. At first, McKay is hesitant. He only agrees because he's promised that he won't have to compromise his values. But as the campaign progresses, he finds himself increasingly manipulated by political consultants and then pressured to sacrifice his principles in order to gain voter appeal. The film ends ambiguously with McKay's victory and his famous question,
"Marvin, what do we do now?"
which sort of underscores his sense of disillusionment and lack of a clear vision post-campaign. Like, okay, we've played dirty to win, but how are we actually going to govern this country? I can only imagine how this would have played out if we were celebrating the victory of President Kanye. The candidate's main influence on American politics was through exposing the cynical strategies behind political campaigns. Among other things, it highlighted the growing role of image consultants and media handlers and political marketing tricks. It pointed out the gap between a candidate's ideals and the compromises they all had to make if they wanted to win. The film was popular with both audiences and political figures, though, unlike some of the movies we talked about before, but it did reinforce skepticism about the authenticity of campaign messaging even further. Its realistic portrayal of the campaign process inspired lots of other political dramas, and it influenced how voters and politicians viewed the contradictory nature of running for office. It's a straight-up critical reflection on the American electoral process, and people ate it up. I don't know about you, but to me, that seems pretty relevant today, where politicians will say anything to win, and the fact that candidates are lying to us has become so normalized it's almost expected. And it's thanks to movies like The Candidate that these issues got exposure on a widespread scale to begin with. Personally, if I'd met someone in 2024 who said they even mostly trusted what politicians said, I think I'd question their grip on reality. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise then that by the time the 80s rolled around, a decade when the post-war optimism and idealism in America were shifting pretty quickly towards cynicism, that the public was now even more suspicious than ever before about the authenticity of politicians. They might have bought into the realness of films like Primary 25 years ago, but now most people felt like you couldn't take anything politicians said or did at face value. And no event made people more distrustful of their leaders like the Watergate scandal and the resignation of Nixon. So it's no surprise that filmmakers started to explore these stories, trying to figure out what the secret lives of their presidents were actually like once the cameras and publicists were gone. 1984's Secret Honor took this to a new level. The whole film is a single monologue from Nixon, played by Philip Baker Hall, and it's a truly unique bit of filmmaking, almost more like a play than a traditional movie. Everything takes place in Nixon's study after his fall from grace, as he just rants to himself about his political career.
"Here is the plan, Richard."
All the conspiracies surrounding him, his perceived enemies, and his personal motivations. It's a really compelling introspective portrait of a man weighed down by the scandal, and it shows Nixon as a complex, flawed figure grappling with guilt, ambition, and paranoia. Now, Secret Honor isn't a straightforward political drama exactly, but it still made a major impression on audiences. Its raw, unfiltered perspective on Nixon's personality, going into those themes of power and corruption and betrayal, it all influenced the American political discourse by encouraging even more critical examinations of political figures beyond their PR images. By humanizing Nixon while also illustrating his flaws, the film helps shift how the public judged its politicians, focusing on their personal complexities and their inner struggles instead of what they said during the presidential addresses and press conferences. If anyone in the American public still thought of their politicians as larger than life or morally superior beings, films like Secret Honor were putting the final nails in that coffin. Skip ahead to the 90s, and the cynicism around political leaders hadn't gone anywhere. The trends that built up over the whole century before it around media manipulation and the stay in power at all costs attitude of elected officials didn't stop, as we obviously know, having just gone through one of the craziest and most publicized elections of all time. But of all the films on this list, not many predicted real-life events quite as accurately as Barry Levinson's Wag the Dog. I actually saw this movie in theaters after my parents dragged me there as a kid. I think I was like 12 years old maybe, and at the time I was way too young to get it. But now, looking back, it's actually wild to see how close to the truth this film turned out to be. The movie is like a dark satire about a fictional US president who manufactures a fake war to distract the public from a major sex scandal that broke just weeks before an election. Specifically, it tells the story of a PR spin guy played by Robert De Niro and a Hollywood producer played by Dustin Hoffman who get hired to create a media spectacle around a fake conflict in Albania to try and shift the public attention away from the fact that the president had been caught hitting on a teenage girl. By pointing the media to the war instead of the scandal, the film showed the dangerous potential for media manipulation in the pursuit of political goals. Now that's a pretty interesting story in itself, but then when you remember that just a month later, the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal broke and we saw the exact same scenario play out literally, it goes from interesting to a bit scary. The Clinton administration actually did start bombing Syria and Iraq very soon after the scandal, and it's so close to the plot of the movie, you almost wonder if the writers knew something the rest of us didn't. Not everyone remembers this movie, but its influence is still with us today, and it actually popularized the phrase wag the dog to describe situations where a political leader uses distraction tactics or manipulative media narratives to divert attention from the issues that matter. Now, if that isn't related to the election cycle that just passed, I don't know what is, because if any president in history has managed to shift attention away from bad behavior by redirecting the narrative towards external threats, I gotta say Trump has been the most successful again. I mean, the whole Stormy Daniels thing is at least as sensational as the Lewinsky affair, but somehow there were virtually no real-world repercussions for Trump as the narrative surrounding the border crisis and a bunch of other international conflicts just dominated the news cycle pretty shortly after. Again, it doesn't matter what you think about Trump, but you have to admit the guy really does know how to wag the dog. These days, not many people think about the war in Serbia or Clinton's bombing of Iraq, and at the time, the public didn't really think that much about the consequences of the US's widespread foreign interventions in general. It was just sort of the accepted narrative about America's place in the world order, at least for a lot of people. But that all changed in 2004. And again, it was satire that Hollywood used to make its point. And no film that I can think of nailed the political comedy quite as well as Team America: World Police.
Hey, terrorists! Terrorize this.
I mean, the movie stars a bunch of hilariously janky puppets, but that didn't stop it from having a massive impact on the political dialogue. Just in case you haven't seen it, the film follows Team America, an elite squad of puppet commandos dedicated to fighting terrorism worldwide. And they use these like crazy over-the-top aggressive tactics that often cause massive collateral damage. It's one big exercise in making fun of American militarism and the idea of the US acting as the self-appointed world police. And the crazy thing is, it actually brought those issues into the public conversation. Like, I'm sure you've heard someone go, "America!" ironically whenever a story comes up about how the US is being a bully overseas, or even just to make fun of obnoxious tourists. That all kind of went mainstream with this silly puppet movie and its slogan. America! Yeah! What you gonna do when we come for you now? This movie just straight up made it popular to call out nationalistic rhetoric, even if that random guy you hear saying America while watching the news might not have thought about it quite that explicitly. It also raised questions about the complexities of global policing, which is wild for a movie that played a scene of two puppets having sex for nearly a full minute. The legacy of this movie can't be overstated, and even though it's not going to appear on many critics' lists of high cinema, this might be one of the movies that changed the public's attitude towards international policy more than any other. I'm not saying that military interventionism stopped because of it, because obviously it didn't, but even if it was totally ridiculous, it made it normal for the public to call out American exceptionalism, not just the academic elites. But if Team America was mainly focused on what the US does overseas, my personal favorite political movie from the 2010s once again came back to the individual politician to caution the public about the dangers of unchecked behind-the-scenes power. And here I'm talking about Vice, Adam McKee's portrait of Dick Cheney as he rose from a rural upstart to climb the ranks of the government all the way to the office of the vice president. As a cinematographer myself, I'm kind of tempted to nerd out here on how it was an important film technically speaking, because the DP Greg Fraser used a bunch of LED lighting in innovative ways. That's a bit beyond the scope of this video. What is relevant though is that the story focused on the backroom aspects of Washington power and how far certain people were willing to go to sidestep the rules if it helped them get what they wanted. Because even though a lot of the films we talked about in this video explore themes of politicians doing sketchy things, Vice showed in a really believable way how personal ambition and calculated moves could drive decisions with massive global consequences. And because this was a major movie starring Christian Bale, the film was also accessible to viewers whose eyes would normally glaze over at the mention of Dick Cheney in the news. Like a lot of political films in the past, Vice pushed viewers to question the transparency transparency and accountability of government officials, raising awareness about how decisions made by a few people in high office could dramatically impact millions. The consequences of what Dick Cheney helped start, especially in the Middle East, were still unfolding even as the movie was in theaters, and so instead of a look back at a distant historical event, it revealed the dark side of power and politics and the decisions which continue to affect the global order and policy decisions in the US today. I mean, it's actually possible to imagine that had Cheney never gotten into the White House, the invasion of Iraq may not have happened. And the fact that just one powerful guy operating behind the scenes could be responsible for so much violence was a wake-up call for a lot of people. At least it was for me. Whether or not anything has changed is another story though. And now, finally, we're in the present moment, and the loss of confidence in American political leaders and their motives is at an all-time low. As we all just saw in the recent election, the country is deeply divided along partisan lines, and neither side seems willing to back down an inch. As an outsider looking in, it kind of feels like there's no room for compromise anymore. Like, once you've picked your team, you're expected to get on board with everything that team stands for, no matter what. Like, if you're a fiscal conservative who believes in climate change or a social democrat who supports corporate tax cuts, just as examples, you're already kind of out of sync with the rest of the tribe. In the past, like post-World War II, the difference between Democrats and Republican policies were not nearly so different. I mean, it was Richard Nixon, a Republican, who created the Environmental Protection Agency back in the day. It definitely feels like there used to be a lot more room for politicians to explore policies without rigidly sticking to their party's narrative, whereas today, it's all about sticking with your team no matter what. Like, imagine if Trump suddenly started campaigning for immigrant rights, or if Kamala Harris started talking about funding extensions to the border wall in the final days of their campaigns. I'm pretty sure each of their bases would have been shocked. You pick a team and then it's ride or die. At least that's how it kind of feels to me. And once you've picked a side, the other side is increasingly seen as your enemy, and that's where things get bad. So it's not a surprise that Hollywood is reflecting on this trend of internal division as well, and no film explores this more literally than Alex Garland's Civil War. The movie is set in an alternate reality where a Southern alliance led by Texas and California has taken up arms against a fascist president who won't give up the office. It's a pretty obvious warning about the dangers of letting the divide between Americans get any deeper before something goes seriously wrong. The terrifying thing is that it's not actually impossible to imagine, because having gone through the last election cycle, I think it's safe to say that things felt very, very tense. I mean, there were multiple assassination attempts, which is never a good sign of political stability. There's a lot of anger out there right now, and once a population starts seeing its fellow citizens as enemies because of their political views, we're on very dangerous ground. But what I personally found most interesting about the film was the reaction to it. People on both sides were really mad, and mainly it felt like it was because they were expecting to have their personal opinions reinforced in the story. Like, a thing I heard again and again in the criticisms was missed opportunity, as though people were expecting a more literal condemnation of current politics. But what missed opportunity seems to mean to me is that they wanted to have their own opinions reflected back to them in the movie, and they were disappointed that it was a bit more vague. I also heard a lot of people complaining that Texas and California would never work together, and so the film was completely unrealistic. Now, personally, I think this was exactly the point of the story, and these complaints just really enforced the message it was trying to send. Like, if it's inconceivable to some Americans that two of their most populated states could ever set aside their differences and work together, doesn't that tell us something about the precariousness of this whole situation? Are things so bad that they wouldn't come together even to fight a fascist dictator? That's kind of a scary reaction in my opinion. It does seem like the central message, i.e. the need for people to set aside their partisanship in favor of keeping the country from spiraling into authoritarianism, that message was mostly ignored, at least in the majority of critiques I saw. Instead, people wanted the film to be more in line with what they already thought, sort of like how most people's social media feeds are just echo chambers for what they already believe in. For me, that made it one of the most interesting films in recent memory on a meta level, regardless of what you thought about the story, and that's what this video is all about. So where does that leave us after a full century of films about politics? What were the trends and what are the takeaways? Well, the main message that came through again and again is to be very careful with who you elect. The wrong people getting too much power leads to horrible abuses, and hopefully that's something we can all agree on. Media manipulation has grown steadily over the last century to the point where it's almost impossible to know what's genuine and what's just being said to win votes. And regardless of who you voted for or how you feel about the results of last week's election, I'd hope those are ideas most people can recognize as important. And since artists have always been some of the most influential voices when it comes to sounding alarm bells, hopefully the issues and concerns raised over the last 100 years of filmmaking won't be ignored in favor of just sticking with your team. See ya!